Sorry, muted. Can you? Hey, Phil, can you hear me now talking?
I can. Thank you very much indeed. That's very helpful. Thank you.
All right, sure. Okay. We got 30 people. Give it 1 minute and then we'll start, I guess. Well, I guess let's get started. We only have an hour. We have a couple of good documents to talk about. There's been some discussion on the list. So, welcome to the HTTP API at IETF 111. Would have been San Francisco, but we're still all virtual. Who knows what's going to happen in November, which is currently scheduled for Madrid. So, welcome to Video Land. Some administrative overhead. Proceedings at the IETF are governed by the Note Well. By the end of the week, we were originally scheduled for Friday. This got moved to today, Tuesday, so it might be newer to some of you, as opposed to by the end of the week, everyone's burned out from seeing all of these bullets. There are particular policies, contributions. If you speak up at a meeting, you are agreeing to be governed by these Note Well processes. We're not going to go over the details of them, but basically treat people with respect, acknowledge that the meetings may be made public. In fact, we record most of these videos. You can see in the lower right corner it says recording, and they are often put out on our YouTube channel. Page 2, definitive information is in these documents. If you go to the IETF.org website and search for Note Well, probably a single hyphenated word, you'll find links, live links to all of these documents. Administrative stuff. Note Well, we did. We need a minute taker. Does anyone want to speak up in the chat and say they're willing to take minutes? It's a fairly easy thing. You don't have to record conversations and what people say. Mainly, the minimum is record this document. Here's the action item. Here's the progress, if you want. It's a live editing via CodeMD. Markdown stuff, the split screen. I'm sorry, the slide says 111 Acme. That's obviously it should be 111-HTTP API. That's my old working group. If somebody wants to go there and edit their minutes, feel free. But we do need somebody to take minutes, and we can't proceed without it. Okay. You really don't want me to pick somebody at random. Mike Bishop. Not random.
Sure, I can do that.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Mike is a co-worker of mine, so I owe him that. All right, we have a minute taker. This is the agenda culled from the mail that Daryl sent to the mailing list a few days ago. We have a couple presentations set and some other documents that we can talk about. Anybody have any changes they'd like to see made to the agenda? You can unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. If you want to just get, okay, or the other deal is you can ask to join the queue, which is on the far left of the upper left-hand corner of the screen. And let me go click on, Mark, go ahead.
It'd be a good idea, maybe if we have time left at the end, to go over the list of proposals on the discussions repo and see if, try and gauge whether there's interest in pursuing those. Probably not actually, talking about adoption or anything, just general discussion.
Okay. Sure. Noted. Anybody else? All right. Well, Mark, why don't you stay there on the queue, because I think you'll be up next. Two screens, never know what to click. So let's talk about the documents.
I think citizens first, isn't it?
Yep, you want me to run the slides or do you want to run them, Mark?
So first up was just a discussion around link set.
Oh, okay. Sure. Go ahead, Daryl. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So we are at the point where we are approaching very close near to last call. There appears to be one open thread on the mailing list. And I was just wondering whether we can have some opinions and maybe make some progress on that particular issue, or at least get a status on where we think we'll end up. So the item that is open is whether or not the JSON representation of the link set should include support for multilingual titles. It seems to be fairly agreed upon that it is not a large use case, but there's the question of, well, is the consistency between the formats more important than the additional complexity that has been added? And I pasted the link in the chat to the discussion. I see the primary conversation. Julian isn't with us, probably time zone wise, and looks like Eric isn't there either. So it might be a rather stilted conversation that we probably should take back to the list then. Phil, you have?
Well, just to say, I was one of the people taking part in the conversation. Hello, everybody. Phil
Right.
Richard, GS1. And yeah, I think it was my phrase, vanishingly small number of websites use content negotiation by language. I wish it were more, but it just isn't. And serious people don't like content negotiation at all, let alone content negotiation by language. So it does add complexity. I just dread the thought of going back to people. We've been telling everybody, we've implemented Ligset. It's not going to change now. We're not going to change it. This is now stable. And now we're talking about changing it. I'm just going to look slightly red-faced if we have to go and change it. But that is a very, very, very poor reason to want it to stay as it is. I understand that. So if it changes, okay. But we've kind of implemented it the way it is with multilingual labels. And it wasn't a big problem.
Out of curiosity, the folks involved with link relation types, is there any opinion as to whether or not the JSON serialization should maintain consistency there? Any concern about it if it were to, if we were to go forward with removing that? Mark, go ahead.
I can see both sides of the argument here. I don't have any strong opinions right now. I should probably go and dig into the issue a bit more.
Okay, well, I'm sure Eric and Julian can listen to recording and we can take the conversation back to the list. Hopefully we can close off that issue and then we will make the recommendation to go to last call. Any other comments on the topic before we move on? Okay. So going back to Rich's question earlier, Mark, do you want to share your slides?
Is that possible? Sure. How do I do that?
There's a share preloaded slides button that's up near the top.
Really?
So there we
Okay.
go.
Yeah, that looks good. Sure. I did that. Thank you. Can I just tell you when to forward them? Is that okay? Okay, cool.
I'm assuming that's
yeah. So this is RFC 7807 bis, revision of the problem details for HTTP APIs document. Next slide. So there's the issues list. The sub bullets are the ones that have been closed recently. So we've done a lot of editorial and procedural kind of updates. And oh, that's okay. Now it's back. We kind of had just a question of whether or not to keep the XML serialization. We decided that it was doing no harm, or no more harm than any other XML format, so we kept it. We added a preliminary and non-normative JSON schema into Appendix A. It pretty much has to be non-normative because JSON schema is not adopted by the IETF yet. It doesn't have any status, and we can't really reference it normatively without a lot of headaches. And we also did some kind of clarification around the use of URIs in types and instances in number 11 and 14, but there's still some work to do there, I think, which we'll get to in a second. Next slide. So I wanted to go through some of the open issues. This is not all of them, but these are kind of the high points to get any feedback that people wanted to give. The first is number 6, multiple problems. This is where you have multiple instances of the same problem. Sorry, there are two major cases here that we can identify. One is when a service has multiple instances of the same problem. So, for example, there were 15 validation errors in the input, and this seems like it's relatively easy to address. It's a best practice and problem design issue. We need to give people some examples and give some guidance about how to create problem types that can convey multiple instances of the same problem and what that might mean. So that's relatively straightforward. The more interesting part of this is when you have multiple problems of different types at the same time. So there's a validation error and, I don't know, there's an authentication error at the same time, for example. And so, when we put together 7807, one of the design goals was that, there can only be one HTTP status code. The problem is just explaining that status code with more detail. And so if in HTTP, there's this natural processing order where you do things like check for authentication or check to make sure the method is supported and all these other different things. And then eventually you process the content. And so, the natural way to do this in HTTP is to choose the first or the most important problem and give the details about that, assuming that if the client corrects that problem, then it will resubmit the request. If there's another problem, well, it'll have to deal with that after that. The other way of going about this would be to create a multiple problem type or a whole new media type to encapsulate multiple problems. But that kind of doesn't really fit well with the way that HTTP works, and it kind of shoves people towards a situation where they have to have a really bland generic status code, often the multi-status status code to, what is it, 217? I forget. 207. It's been a while. It was defined by WebDAV for this kind of situation, and it's quite obscure. And so my inclination after the discussion and going back and forth is that we should recommend in this case that you choose one and surface that problem type and give some people some guidance along those lines. And I wanted to talk through that, see what other people had feedback on. If you go to the issue, it seems like we've seen a variety of different positions, but some support for that position. I'm not sure if it's enough. Any thoughts? Chat for people's convenience.
Can you hear me? This is Sanjay.
Hear you.
Hello.
Yes.
Ed Sanjay.
This is my favorite issue, Mark. Actually, I wanted to know from if there are people on the list here who have used 7807 and how they dealt with this, because I also know that when we looked at it a while back in PayPal, we had to then define our own response type for errors where you can have multiple instances, and that kind of was not a good thing. If you could have adopted RFC 707, that would have really helped. But I think this was one issue where we thought that it doesn't solve our purpose, and PayPal defined its own type. And I believe that Microsoft also has done something similar. Probably Daryl can give some more information on that. But people do then, developers define their own type, and that reduces the acceptance of 7807. So I want to know from others what they think about this. We can always add examples, provide more guidance, but if they are still going to go and define their own type, then it defeats the purpose.
Right, and I think what's not clear to me is that if some people have gone up and defined a generic multiple problem type, if that's because they didn't have any guidance or because they really needed that, and I'd be interested to talk through.
Just as another example, the Microsoft API follows from OData specification, and it does support the idea of having multiple. I have to admit, I don't see very much use of it, and the few cases we do see it, it's because the request that is made is more of a batch type of operation. It's do this thing add these 5 different things, and some of them will succeed and some of them will fail. So it's not a generalized we need multiple error responses, and it certainly could be dealt with in saying some of the with an error type that some of the items failed, and then in the further details enumerating which were the ones that failed and potentially why. Mike.
just wanted to say that I've basically been returning, the case where this comes up for me is usually in 400 class errors, input problems, or something's missing, and using the examples in the 7807 seems pretty fine to me. I just returned like the invalid params array or something like that. If it comes up to actually being different status codes, I, like Mark had talked about, just pick the first one that's encountered and stop there. I don't think we should kind of invent something that leads someone into kind of mucking about with the status codes in any way. I think the resolution that's on here, which is guidance on how to, return multiple instances of the same problem, is just guidance on some arrays, and I would say they should choose one from the top of the stack. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it goes down to also the details of things like if you create a problem type of invalid phone number, for example, that's probably too granular because it precludes other kinds of invalid things on the same, in the same request. And so some advice about the granularity of problem types is probably useful as well. And maybe this gets to another issue which we'll discuss, which is the possibility of a registry of problem types that are well defined and suitable for use. So what I might do is start to work on a PR to show people and then see if that convinces folks that this is the right way to go, if that makes sense.
Chair Deba?
Paul, I think the reason that Sanjay described as multiple problem types were needed for 400 cases. So we had like very standardized and generalized problem types like malform request, invalid array, minimum minimum item, array item, max item, invalid integer value. So we had bunch of enumeration for 400. So and given a request, we could emit multiple problem types, and the reason why we could not use 7807 as is for 400 was one of the reasons. So if we can standardize, have some general enumeration for 400s where we can emit multiple problem types instead of just saying invalid param, I think that would help towards adoption.
Sanjay?
Yeah. So the first one, I think the multiple instances of the same problem is the most common thing which I would think. The second one happens in limited use cases. So if everyone thinks that examples and guidance would help, that's great. I had also suggested, should we have those common problem types defined somewhere. I think I'm trying to remember the answer on that, but as Jayadeva was saying that, some of the problem types might be common across APIs and where those could be defined. So probably Mark is going to cover that with the registry issue, I guess.
Okay, so I'll write a PR and put it to the list, and we can talk through that. I think maybe seeing it in text might help us make a decision here. So next slide. So issue number 7 is indeed that very issue. We talked about this, I think, in our last meeting, and we kind of came to a place where we said an IANA registry was probably a good idea. And so I put together a PR for that, which seems to have some support. I think the only question here is whether or not we use an we recommend an HTTP prefix for those problem types, or whether we recommend the URN form of URI for those problem types. Does anybody have any preferences?
Max, go ahead.
We implemented the problem types in a library. One of the things we did is we if we encounter an error, is we link to a wiki page. Would something like that stop being possible with this?
Are actually registered. So it's not for ones that you define on your own.
Okay, this is only for ones you want to use over multiple APIs.
Right. And what form would those URIs take? I think, using the HTTPS URI is effectively an advertisement for the registry, so people can go and find the registry easily and get perhaps a little bit more information about the type. Whereas the URN, obviously, you can't dereference it. It's a little more compact. We don't have to worry about load issues on the INS server. So, although people are doing the right thing, they won't be dereferencing those automatically anyway. So I don't have strong feelings about this one.
Yeah, Deb?
Should this be prefixed with HTTP at all, or we can avoid because we can think of using this problem type definition for non-HTTP protocols as well, like messaging or elsewhere. So maybe prefixing it HTTP may make it very specific and dissuade to use in other protocols if we want to use. Just an opinion.
But it's really just being used as an identifier here. It's not being used to dereference the URI. So at least as part of the protocol operation. And furthermore, that the whole scope of the document is very explicitly HTTP problems. It's not trying to be a universal, protocol problems listing.
Okay.
Sanjay?
Before this, I was reading that thread on the multiple problems, and you said that the status code error has to semantically refer proper status code, and that made me think that ideally what I was expecting was that the response that comes in HTTP may be formed at some other layer, which is not at the, let's say, HTTP server may not be doing it. And it may be coming from somewhere else, some business service down or domain service downstream, which might be forming that error response. And then when it bubbles on the top, there it is associated with the status code and sent it over the wire in response. So that helps, if it is now, a problem type has a status code defined in it and we cannot change it. I saw your response on that, but I was just thinking that what Jaideva was mentioning, right? In the messaging system, you could still use this response problem type and problem details associated with it. And either it can stream over non-HTTP protocol, and then you can associate it with HTTP status when it comes on the top. I just wanted to bring it up.
It's effectively just a message, a piece of content that is happening over HTTP. Yeah. So I'm not hearing any strong feelings about this. So I'll just recommend one, and we'll see if it sticks. Mike?
I prefer the URN, just to throw that in the mix. It's a little less likely to be dereferenced and more likely, I think, to be easily managed, but that's just me.
Okay.
Thanks.
We'll give it a try as a URN and see if any problems come up. How about that? Okay. Next slide. So issue number 15. So as I understand it, some folks who want to build tooling for handling problems or debugging want to be able to tell deterministically whether or not the type URI is dereferenceable, so they can condition their behavior on that to say, to present to the user, for more information, follow this link or whatever. And so that could be a Boolean flag, yes, the type URI is resolvable. Feel free to go and try and show it to the user. Or it could be, excuse me, a separate field, in case the documentation has to move, but you don't want the type URI to change. I think there's maybe a whole discussion to be had around which of those two forms is preferable. But the function is still the same, is to give those tools a more solid hint. But I think it can only be a hint because, at runtime, when the debugging tool is actually running, it could try and dereference that URL and discover that there's a network problem, or it's a 404, or whatever. And so it's not, a guarantee. It's still just a hint. Furthermore, to complicate this even more, I think adding a new standard member, so a new member to the problem dictionary, 7807 doesn't allow that because it can conflict with the extension attributes, the extension, the type-specific metadata. And so it's a closed set there. That may or may not be a great design for this JSON, but that's how it was done in 7807. And so I guess the question here is, what do we do? I think the options on the table are, if we think that adding a new member is going to break existing problem types, well-defined problem types, we can create a new media type, which we've discussed in the past and shied away from. The problem is that by doing so, we're going to perhaps bifurcate support. The more different formats for this you have out there, the harder it is to get momentum behind any one format. And so that's not great. We could convince ourselves that adding a new standard member is not going to break anyone. And if we can convincingly do that, we can just go ahead and do it. I think the problem there is that knowing all the different problem types that are existent out in the world is difficult. It's not like this specification has seen hugely wide adoption, but I don't really have confidence that we have everybody who's using it in the room here today or on the mailing list. We cannot do this. We can just say, if you want to surface this information to users, you have to, do a predictive lookup in the background, and if it succeeds, then you can change your UX, maybe cache the result to make that a little less painful, and so forth, and maybe write some text about how you would do that. So what do folks think?
Derek, you want to go ahead?
If we want to encourage people to write docs, wouldn't it be wise that whatever we choose, the default is the docs would be resolvable, and the other option is that you indicate that it's not resolvable?
I believe there is a requirement that the docs should be resolvable. It's a should level requirement. So
yeah, exactly.
We already encourage people to do that. If they really don't want to do that, personally, I think that if you really don't ever want your docs to be resolvable, you should make it a URN or some obviously non-resolvable URI scheme. But having said that, I think there's a lot of merit to having the docs eventually be resolvable. So.
Yeah, I agree. So we actually do resolve docs, the same as Max says, usually a wiki page. But as you say, we might be down, you might have a network error. So I don't think we can ever guarantee it unless it's loading from local. The options that I saw that seemed reasonable to me is providing it via the link header that could come on the same problem result. So you don't actually need to specify this in. You can actually specify it on top of 7807, or use a standard member that's actually 2 characters or less, because that seems to be possible with your previous specification.
I think so. From API developers' perspective, there is real cost if the developer experience is hurt by not providing enough information about the error. And it also increases support cost and all that stuff. So if it is a separate link header, it may not help because how the error is processed on the client side, it should rather be with the actual problem details object rather than somewhere else. That's my opinion. But I think for this, we really need to consider that aspect where any API developer who is sending the error response with problem details object, um, it should help to resolve the issue. It should help the consumer of the API to resolve the issue quickly, and more information that could be provided better. So the URI, it seems like, is a better choice in my opinion, even if it may sometimes not work.
Dirk, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I agree with Sanjay. I think I wasn't extremely clear in my suggestion. My suggestion was, if you want to indicate that the documentation lives somewhere else, I would suggest a link header. Or if you want to indicate you can't resolve it, I would indeed suggest a URN or a link that has the rel document that is a URN or an about blank or something that doesn't, or that's meant to not resolve. I would definitely keep the standard of having the type by default be supposed to resolve to docs.
Mike?
Yeah, actually, I pretty much agree with what Dirk just said. I use URNs when I don't think they're going to be resolvable. I don't want them to be resolvable. And I use URLs when I want them to be resolvable. And I just realize that they're hints and that they may not work. That's basically it. And I usually write that up in the docs, and that's the end of it. So no change in the spec for me.
So I'm hearing that the default of the type URL being resolvable to docs is a good thing, and that we shouldn't change that. And I don't hear I hear people saying if we do this, it should be a flag saying it's not resolvable, but I'm not hearing strong urgency behind that. I guess from my standpoint, it's kind of a I really mean it flag. We've tried this in protocols before where you say something, but it's not always true, and so you're just adding more noise to the mix. You're like we said, it's just a hint. So again, I don't have incredibly strong feelings about this. Would anyone be sad if we resolve this by well, what would we do? I think resolve it with no real changes except maybe some explanation and refinement of the text to make the design principles clear here. Is that okay for everyone?
You seem to have mostly agreement, or all agreement from what I can see.
I'll review the text and see if anything needs to change to better explain any of this. And if so, do a PR, but otherwise I'll just put a proposal to close out there. Is there a next slide? There is. Wait, no, that
Nope.
was the one we just did. That's it? Okay, I'm done, thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
We'll make progress on these issues, and once them and a few others are wrapped up, I don't think we should be terribly far away from working group last call.
Excellent. And so, Rich, I believe next up is the item potency key. Sanjay, take it away.
All right, so I'll just cover a few slides, and then my co-author Jaydeva would walk us through the issues and status. So next slide, please, Rich. So just a brief history. It's very new header. Probably 7-8 months back, Jaydeva and I were talking, and he reminded that we had something done in PayPal. We had used a header named PayPal request ID for item potency. So we started researching, and we found lots of different types of headers used and a couple of approaches. Reached out to Mark. Mark had done what you call post once exactly earlier. So we thought it's a good idea to propose to this working groups. That's what we did recently. Next slide, please. So I think a lot of people know here about this particular use case, but post and patch in HTTP are not idempotent. And post is used a lot in HTTP APIs. And there are many use cases where duplicate processing of the post request could be really expensive and hurt the business, especially in a money transfer use cases. So you can find a lot of different ways in which people have tried to address this using different headers. So request ID is one example. Then, for example, in PayPal, as I mentioned, PayPal request ID was used. Open banking and PSD2 uses X idempotency key. And then there are cases where the idempotency key is added inside the request body. I think Square and Google do that. So various different kinds, but we found a lot of implementations using the header name that is associated with this draft idempotency key. I think I have a slide for that. So the idea was that if we have a header defined by the HTTP API working group, that could help. And we found few instances already after we released the draft. Next slide, please. So here is a list. Stripe, Adyen, Voila, all those people were already using idempotency key as a header. And then once we released the draft, we found HTTP for Scala, Finastra, and Datatrans. At least these are the three we know of. who have used the header which is released under HTTP API working group. PayPal, Django, Twilio, Razorpay, Open Banking, all are using different header names. And Google and Square are using idempotency key in the request body. Next slide, please. So I want to give it to Jayadeva now to walk us through the different issues. Jaydev.
Yes, so we have a few issues raised against the draft. So the first one being the whether around the status quo, right? Whether the idempotency implementation should return the previously processing status, or should it return the latest status? Because it may happen that by the time the client retries a request, some other client might have modified that resource, and the resource state might change. So um, um, I think the argument there is yes. So we can return the previous processing state when the client is retrying, because it relates to the request it has sent, and if the client wants the latest representation of the resource, it can always do a get, the conditional get, uh, right? So that was one thing. The other thing is around usage of words should instead of must, for the condition. So some implementation saying whether we need to consider a fingerprint part of the contract, and so should we use, can that language be softened to should. Uh, so that was the issue one, and the issue two is again around using the status code. So uh, the status code of returning 204 when the idempotent request is already processed, to a different status code to the client saying this is already processed. So there was a suggestion to return 204. Again, the discussion is the argument there is we can return the same status code, so the client knows the exact status of what happened to the request with the complete resource representation. So 204 um, um, doesn't help in a great deal, because when the client is retrying, it wants to know the resource details, whether full or the or the resource link, and that can be emitted through 200 or through 201. So 204 is not really required. Uh, Again, the second suggestion around the softening of language for from must to may and should for the idempotency conditions, saying the implementer must return the previous status code versus the and previous status versus the current state of the resource. So we will make that soften the language. So this issue will resolve by softening language. Next one. So this is the issue raised by Google, multiple issues. So again, one is in the contract there is bit of confusion around wording. So everywhere it says the idempotency contract is a key plus fingerprint. So the submitter was asking, but the wording when you describe that condition, it says or instead of and. So the submitter was asking, uh, it should be and, so that it's not confusing that both key and fingerprint are part of the contract. So that's one thing, one issue. The other issue, as part of this sub issue, as part of the issue is for failure condition that can be retried, like 429, 500, 404. Should the idempotency implementation, server-side implementation, return the previous status code, which can be 409, 500, or any kind of recoverable error, or should it just reprocess the request and the idempotency server not persist these recoverable error statuses at all? I think that's a fair ask, right? So the ask here is either we soften language from must to should. So it is up to the implementer to decide whether for recoverable errors, whether it needs to still return the previous error, which means the client may need to regenerate a key in order to retry a request if the previous status was a recoverable error. Which means there would be more traffic to the server. So I think the submitter wants the language to be clarified that way. And yeah, so those are mainly uh, two issues. And the third thing was third thing is the submitter wants uh, some language around the idempotency key, uh, because the client can send a key that can collide with the previous any previous key. So the argument here is that server will create a composite key, and if server, regardless of what client sends, and as long as that key the client sent is unique, based on the whatever the server generated composite key, it should be fine. But the submitter wants again those conditions and all the details to be put in the document, which will put and clarify. Next one. So issue 4 is really about the OSC standard, which has a similar header. In fact, three headers: the repeatability request ID, similar to idempotency key, and repeatability client ID, which is an optional parameter that client sends, and then repeatability first send, which is the timestamp that client sends. So there is an OSC standard, and which is in place. So we just came to know about this yesterday. So we'll work with the authors there and reconcile the standards and resolve the issues. So we have some concerns around the OSC standard even states that you can use that key even for put and delete requests, which are natural idempotent and as defined in HTTP, right? And it also there is a lot of constraint that you feel in on the server side to implement that standard. So we'll work on this and with those authors and reconcile the standard and resolve the issue. So more updates in the working group issue. Yeah. Also, so this was the OCC issue. Okay, I missed it. What was the previous one? For yeah, this
Conditional request. Using conditional request instead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, conditional request. So this was raised by Eric, and is like the idempotency can also be implemented by using if non-match, all those conditional headers. So that seems kind of an alternative implementation to implementing idempotency using posts. So I think this is not in the scope of this draft, right? This is not in the scope of the draft to say what are the alternative ways to implement an idempotent post request if you are not doing using post. But we'll see if we can make some references to saying that this is not the only way to implement, right? But there are several other ways to implement idempotency, and this draft is all about if you want to implement idempotency using post. So yeah, so these are all the issues, and we'll work towards resolving them. So, and
So I guess there are a couple of things. So one is about working with the OS's OData group. We came to know about the header that they have proposed yesterday, as Jayadeva was saying. If the working group has any suggestion how we proceed further with them, and we'll talk to them and we'll figure out. But I guess it will be best to invite them to have the discussion on our working group. But please, we are looking for some suggestion on the from the group on how to resolve that. And the second thing is, I guess the issue number 4. Eric probably has referred Mike Amundsen's article there, and he's participant here. Would like to know from him what is the suggestion on the issue number 4.
Okay, well, I'm going to take my hand down. I'll let Mike speak to issue number 4 first.
I didn't know Eric was going to post that. It's actually serendipity that article was released close to this discussion. The point I was making was that's an idempotency pattern. I used put. You could use it with post. It's in the spec. I think the challenge you're looking at is the idempotency key examples I'm seeing so far rely on some state on the server, which is going to have some challenges, I think, in terms of whether or not it's been used before and keeping track of a list, possibly even being enlisted in a DDoS attack where somebody just asked for a lot of keys or something. So I'm a little concerned about that. The use of the conditional request, I think, is pretty handy, and I'm wondering if we're not just looking at the idea of using if none match star as really an idempotency key. You don't have to generate a key. You don't have to keep track of it. So it's definitely an alternative, but it's an alternative that's been around for quite a while, right? So 15 years or so. So I think the concern I would have in this proposal is that it's got some state involved, and maybe that's not a big deal, but that's really what I had to add. Thanks.
Mark, go ahead.
It wants permissions. Can you hear me?
We can. Yes.
Okay, that was weird. So regarding that, introducing a new conditional request mechanism into HTTP is not trivial. We had a discussion about this recently in the HTTP working group. You have to consider how it interacts with other conditional request methods very carefully. You have to consider other HTTP features, and you have to consider how to interact with servers and clients who don't support it and doing the right thing. So I would advise some caution before going down that road to do it right. And I think we probably need to pull the HTTP working group in to make sure that we did it right if we wanted to do that. Regarding the next issue about OASIS, I think history has shown that joint working groups or joint work between the IETF and other standards organizations, especially with ones with different rules for participation and membership in IPR, can really be problematic. I think we could invite the OASIS folks to come and participate as IETF participants, as anyone in the world can, of course. Or if interested folks here are want to go over there and help them with their effort, and they have the ability to do that, that's great. I would be concerned if we started to have some sort of joint effort, because it's gone off the rails so many times in the past, XML digital signatures. So that's just kind of my take on that.
Yeah, then we'd have to get. This is Rich. Yes, I think that should really be considered a non-starter, because then we have to get liaison statements done. And as you say, the ways the two SDOs work is very different. The way W3C and OASIS works is much more similar than the way IETF and OASIS does.
We could do some sort of coordination to convince them to do the work over here, or if they can convince us that we don't need to do this and to do it over there, that's great. But if that kind of convincing isn't going to happen, then yeah, I think it's just, we'll have two different things.
Yeah,
Mike.
this is Mike. And I just wanted to follow up on Mark's comment. Mark, were you saying that the use of if none match and if match with post is new, and that's what we need to kind of stay clear of? Is that right? Is that what I'm getting? Or were you talking about something else?
A new if something mechanism. That's what you need to be very careful about.
Oh yeah.
If you can shove it into one of the existing ones, fine.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's currently what I've been doing, and what the article was about. It wasn't about actually creating any other new conditionals, but it was about applying conditionals to post, which is not explicitly, I think, in the text.
Oh, yeah, that's
Put
yeah, we
is
should talk.
explicit
Okay,
in the
that's
text, but it's as guidance, not as
yeah. Have you looked at the
normative.
most
So,
recent spec?
I think
I'm looking at the 7232 that was June 2014. Is there something else?
I'll send you some links.
Thanks.
Sanjay?
Yeah, I think, Mike, probably we can figure out, how the alternate could be used with that. I think I was looking at your article also. Worked with many APIs internally and externally, PayPal and other places. Using put to create something where ID of the resource is provided by the client is probably not the norm that I have seen, but I might be wrong. But regardless, I think we can discuss that as part of evolving this draft. And thanks, Mark, for that OASIS and Rich, that OASIS, how we deal with the OASIS thing. I think we can invite them to participate on our discussions, but we won't try to form something which is joint working group or something like that. But thank you.
Yeah, we're currently, as Daryl's pointing out in the chat here, we're 3 minutes over. And if this were a face-to-face meeting, the room would already be emptying out, because people would be trying to get the cup of coffee and free pastries. But now virtually you'll have to do it on your own. Daryl, you want to say any closing words?
No, just thanks to everybody who brought that content. And Mark, sorry, I didn't notice those items that are in the discussions. I would call everybody to take a look at the discussions tab in the GitHub repo. There's definitely some interesting content in there that we should have a conversation on list about.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, people. This was a really interesting discussion. And thank you very much, Mike, for taking notes. We'll send around the link. People can make corrections. And have a great rest of the week, people. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Okay.